We've already had some time together, but I'm grateful to be with you. I did want to introduce my wife, Lisa. She hates to stand up, so Lisa, will you please stand up and say hello? So, most of us men know that we marry up, and I'm just going to tell you, gentlemen, you have no idea how much I married up with my wife, and so grateful for that. Lisa, I've been married almost 27 years, and we're very excited about what God is doing in our lives. In talking with David, the theme of this conference, the theme of our gathering together is courageous living and courageous leading. So I want to take some time this weekend. I want to talk to you about courage. Not like the Wizard of Oz, courage, but real God-inspired, Christ-led, Spirit-empowered courage. What does courage look like in the everyday life of someone who's surrendered to God? Now, I could take a little bit of time and just say this, that courage comes from Christ. Courage comes from the Holy Spirit. Courage comes from the call of God on your life. I could say all those things and we could be done, we could pray and go out. But David has given me at least 35 minutes, so I'm going to take a little bit longer time. We know those things from Scripture, but here's the question, but what does that look like in real life? What does that look like in the everyday issues of life? What does it look like with a husband and wife who are trying to figure out marriage, and it's just been a short time they've been together, but he's got some secrets. He's got some issues, some problems that he needs to deal with, and he is so afraid of getting vulnerable with her because the things that are going on in his life, he just thinks they're wrong and bad. And how does he approach her? How does he gain courage? Or the mom with the teenage son, and he's off doing things that aren't quite on Christ's path, and she's afraid that she's going to lose that relationship if she pushes too hard. Anyone ever been there? She pushes too hard on it, and she's just afraid that if I say too much, if I try too hard, I'm afraid of what that might do in the short term on the relationship. And yet she's just as afraid of what might happen in the long term if she doesn't say something. It's going to take courage. Or how about that person who's in the church who loves Jesus and loves church and is very proud to be a member of that local church, and they have this friend, this coworker, maybe a relative, maybe a neighbor who doesn't know Jesus. And they just can't seem to muster up the courage to invite them to church or to talk about their relationship with Christ, even though they know that everyone lives forever somewhere. Or the pastor who's come into a new situation, a new church, and he knows there's much needed change. But he also knows that people are very much against change. And he's afraid. Because the last thing he wants to do is to start off poorly. And so when do I bring this up? When do I challenge the status quo? What do I have to do and so he prays and he prays and he prays, but he knows at some point in time he's going to have to say it because they simply don't see it. It's going to take courage. I want to begin the conversation tonight with a statement. And the statement is this, that God is looking for a generation to join him in what he's doing. God is looking for a generation to join him in what he is doing. God is at work in this world, and he invites you and he invites me to join him in what he's doing. The problem is that I also have an agenda, and you also have an agenda, and very often my agenda and your agenda doesn't match up with God's agenda. And in order to get those two to match up, I've got to be courageous in my own life and say, okay, not my will, but your will be done. And it's probably going to cost me something. And I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what I'm going to lose in order to gain what Christ has for me, and I'm just not sure. God is looking for a generation to join him in what he is doing. And the missing element in many people's lives, and the missing element in many Christians' life and in many churches is this thing called courage. It's not that we don't know the right thing to do. We do. Most of the time I do. It's not that we don't know the right thing to do. It's just we don't have the courage to do it. And we need God to bring us to the place where we trust Him, we believe Him, we surrender to Him, we follow Him, and we're willing to take the risk and become a courageous people. We're willing to take the risk to lead and to live courageously. As I look in the Bible, there are a whole bunch of people that live courageous lives, but my favorite of all time is this guy named Nehemiah. Nehemiah is my favorite because he looks like a real guy. And if you read the book of Nehemiah, he writes it like a journal, and he shows you all his emotions. He gets frustrated, he gets angry, he gets upset, he weeps, and he's just a normal person. He talks about his personal struggles. It's written like a diary. It's awesome. I'm so glad there are normal people in the Bible. Because this idea that everyone has it all together, they're in the Bible, they have it all together. I mean, no, if you really read the Bible, see, people who don't read the Bible think people in the Bible have it all together. People who actually read the Bible think, okay, Jerry Springer must have written this. Because they're all messed up. I can't believe what's going on in the Bible. It's better than TV. You should read your Bible. I love Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a man just like you and me. And he's a person who's got struggles and passions and desires, and yet there's something in his life. You see this consistency of doing the right thing, of having courage in the most difficult of times. And my hope in this conversation is that we would unleash the Nehemiah in you. And so let's take a look at Nehemiah chapter 1. And I'm just going to read a few verses and talk about them. And what I'm going to try to do is point out some ingredients of courage. Now, again, I want to say again that courage comes from the Holy Spirit. Read the book of Acts. Everywhere the Holy Spirit is, there's courage. Courage comes from the Holy Spirit. Courage comes from the call of God. Courage comes from being convinced that Christ is right and that He's trustworthy. But what does it look like in real life? And I think Nehemiah has all these things, but look at this. Okay, so here's verse 1. It says, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year. This is the 20th year of Artaxerxes, the king of Persia. He says, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. And they said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. The year is about 446 BC, and we're in Susa, which is the capital, one of the capitals of Persia. And the people of Israel have been there for a long, long time. It was in 605 BC that the first Babylonians came over and sieged Jerusalem and took youths back. And then it happened again later, and then it happened twice in 585. And so 587 was the last time. And they were taken from Jerusalem. They were taken over to Babylon. And what happened was the people of Israel just kind of disappeared from the land. They were exiled. And over in this exile, they began to live life in a foreign land. And it was a while later, there was a king named Cyrus who the Persians took over from the Babylonians. Cyrus said, you can go back. And some did, but most didn't. They had gotten comfortable in a foreign land. And they were actually figured out how to live life in this foreign land. And I guess over time, if you read the story of Daniel, you'll see that. And then Esther becomes the queen, and she's a Jew, and there's some things happening. And here's Nehemiah. He finds himself in a cush job. He finds himself in an easy spot. He's the cupbearer to the king. And he's writing about all the things that are happening. Hanani, his brother, comes back, and he says, well, how are things over in Israel? See, he was in a foreign land, but he was a true Jew. He cared about his people. He loved God. He loved his heritage. He wanted to know what was happening in his homeland. And Hanani says, it's not good. Oh, Nehemiah, the walls are still broken down. The gates have been burned with fire. It's a disgrace. It's bad. He never lost his heart. He never lost his heart for his people. And so when he hears this, it upsets him. And we see this first ingredient for courage. The first ingredient is it's eyes to see. Eyes to see what's really happening. And he looks back at Jerusalem and he hears what's happening. He says the walls are broken down. The gates have been burned with fire. And this holy discontent with the status quo happens in his life. He gets so upset about what's happening in Jerusalem. He doesn't know what to do. He sees something. He thought it was a certain way, but now he knows for sure it's not that way. And it upsets him. It frustrates him. And what we're going to see in this story is he's going to have to get uncomfortable. He's going to have to, because he sees what God sees, he's now going to do what God says. He's going to get uncomfortable for God. He hears the story of Jerusalem, and it's not good, and something's breaking inside of him, so he's going to get uncomfortable. I have found in my life that God has kept me uncomfortable for most of my Christian life. How about you? I have to admit that I like comfort. Can I just admit that? The most comfortable place in my life is actually in my family room. I have a lazy boy recliner, which is appropriately named. It's a lazy boy recliner, and I have DirecTV Genie, and I can sit in that chair and I can watch March Madness. By the way, I was born at Duke University. Go Blue Devils. And I could just sit there and I could be comfortable. I could stay there for a long time and be comfortable. But I have other responsibilities called kids and a wife and a church and a job. But I could be comfortable. I have this shadow mission in my life to be comfortable. I don't know about you, but I like being comfortable. But very often, God doesn't allow me to stay comfortable. Not about the lazy boy. He doesn't allow me to stay comfortable in my life. In fact, he gets me uncomfortable because he wants me to follow him. He wants me to serve him. He wants me to give my life to him. In my Christian life, it was real interesting. I grew up as a pastor's kid, and I think I mentioned that earlier today. I grew up as a pastor's kid, but I was not a believer when I went to college. And I came to Christ in college, and I immediately got involved with Campus Crusade for Christ, and I started working with the sports teams. I was in Athletes in Action, and I worked with a guy named Dell Curry. He's got a son that plays basketball somewhere around here named Steph, and Steph's killing it, And I wish I could say I had some sort of credit in that, but Dell wouldn't recognize me from anybody else. But sorry about that. I can't get you tickets if you were thinking about that. But I had a privilege of working with them. And one day my roommate came back. He was on staff. I was an engineering student. He came back. He was on staff with the crew. And he came back, and he had just led someone who became a very famous athlete to Christ. And we're just talking, and I'm busting my guts in engineering school, and he's out sharing his faith with athletes, and they're coming to Christ. He walks in the apartment, and he says, "Man, this is great. I led so-and-so to Christ. We were celebrating because we've been praying for him for a long time." And then he says this. He says, "I can't believe I get paid to share my faith." And something in me just cracks. Because I'm thinking, wait a minute, I am busting my guts, getting 4 hours of sleep, taking 18 hours for 4.5 years to try to get this degree in engineering. It was 204 credits to get an engineering degree, and it was crazy. And all I want to do is share my faith. All I want to do is tell people about Jesus. And so I'm going to go out and get a job and spend 60 hours working a job in hopes that from the few hours I have left, I can share my faith with somebody. What am I thinking? And so, in a sense, that was my call to become a pastor. And so, now there was a little problem with this. It made me a little uncomfortable because I wasn't paying for my education. My parents were paying for my education. By the grace of God, they were able to pay for me, and I was so thankful. But here I was in my junior year of engineering school, and so I had this conversation with my parents. It kind of went like this: "Mom and Dad, I got good news and I got bad news." They said, "Well, okay, what's the good news?" "The good news is I'm going to get my degree in engineering." And they said, "What's the bad news?" "The bad news is I don't want to be an engineer." Surprise, 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 And you got to understand, my parents are in ministry, and their experience in ministry, Dad burned out in ministry. He was 48 years old. He was done. And it was just, church was hard. And my parents were in that category I would describe as church damaged. It wasn't that God damaged them. It was church. It was their experience with Christians. It was experience with church people that damaged them. You know, the church would be great if people weren't involved. Wait a minute. That's not theologically correct. So, you know, you can't go to church. The church is you. So, but it would just, they were church damaged. And so when I said that, Mom's like, oh no, you know, she's begging me, please don't do that to yourself. Don't torture yourself that way and become a pastor. Does anyone know what I'm talking about here? Okay. So some of us had that, some of us haven't. And I say, Mom, my experience is going to be different. There is no, I mean, she's just so upset. And, you know, anyway, I love you, Mom, but this is what God's calling me to do. And if I have to choose between, you know, what you say and what God says, I'm gonna just follow Jesus. I love you, Mom. And went off to school. You know, went to seminary. At least I got married. Went off to seminary. We worked in a church in South Carolina. It was a small church. It was 16 people. We grew by 37.5% the first Sunday we were there because the new pastor and his wife and his two girls and Lisa and I showed up the same Sunday. So it went from 16 to 22 the first Sunday. Greatest day of growth in that church's history right there, you know? And we were there and, you know, church of 16 people. How bad could that be? You have no idea. I mean, everyone in the church was an elder. The only people left in the church were the elders. We grew up to 250, and then the founding pastor left. A new pastor came in and said, you know what, I love Evangelism Explosion. That's great. You guys have fun. He'd wave at them as they were heading out to Evangelism Explosion as he sat on his porch drinking his, you know, iced tea or whatever it was there. And the church kept declining. So we took over in 1988, and you know, first week, 16 people. I didn't know it could be so tough. 5 years into it, I'm thinking, this is great. The youth group, it's grown back up to 250. The youth group, I'm loving it and having a great time. I got great mentors all around me. I'm so comfortable. And I went to the pastor and said, hey, you know, I'm graduating in June, and I know I'm working full-time, but you're only paying me part-time. Does anyone have that problem? Because that's what happens in church plants. You work full-time, you get paid part-time. That's just part of the deal. And hey, is there any way, since we'd like to start having kids, we've been married 5 years and hadn't planned on kids because we just knew we didn't have the money and we wanted to graduate school and stuff like that. Is the church planning to bring me on full-time? And he said, we would love to. Oh, that's great. We just can't. And so I began looking for a job. Trying to find a job someplace. I mean, how disappointing. My dream was, because my father was in a movement of church, a tradition that they moved all the time. So I moved 11 times before I was 18 years old. I mean, 6 different churches. It was crazy. And just every time I got to know friends, I would move again, and just bad experience. And so now here I am with a dream of being in one place my entire life, and now I'm moving again. And I remember going to a retreat, and there was a pastor there. His name was John Snyder, and I really liked him. And he invited, I said, hey, you need a youth guy. And he said, actually, we just started looking. So we had this interview. He showed me all these different brochures about his church and how great his church was. The church was in Arizona. I'm like, where's Arizona? You know, because I'd never been across the Mississippi River before. And you know, it's like, well, it's out west. I'm okay. So I go home to Lisa, say, Lisa, check out this church. She's like, it has everything we want in the church. Where is it? I said, Arizona. She said, where's Arizona? You know, because, you know, so we go over to Arizona in April to candidate, which is the right time to candidate in Arizona, you know. So we candidate, and at the same time, I'm candidating in this church up in Philadelphia. And the church in Philadelphia is, it's a big church. It's a mega church before mega churches were even around. It had 37 acres of land, 100,000 square feet under roof. It had 2 full gymnasiums, and I was going to be the youth pastor with staff under me. I'd start with 120 high school students. I'm thinking, man, it's 5 minutes from my in-laws, and that wasn't bad because they liked me and I liked them. So it was a perfect place. And then I go to Arizona and they look at me and they say, well, we don't have a building. We meet in a movie theater. And you won't have any staff, and you won't have a building, and you won't have a budget, and we're going to buy you a computer for about $50 at a garage sale because that's all we have. And literally, that's exactly what they did: $50 for a computer. And but what do you think? Will you go for it? Will you come join us? And I looked at the kind of people that the church in Philadelphia was reaching, and they were really just swapping sheep with other churches. It was a lot of Christians, just jumping from church to church, and whoever had the best show at that moment, that's who was coming. And in Arizona, it was people who were far from church, but near to the heart of God. And it sounded crazy, but Lisa and I both felt called not to comfort, but to do what God was doing, to join what God was doing, to get uncomfortable, to drive across the country and to be a part of this church plant in a movie theater. And so we do that. So we get in our truck. A few months later, we're driving across the country, and we're going across Interstate 40. We get to Oklahoma City. The cat gets out into a field, and the hawk tries to kill it, but that's a different story. Can't go into that. So we get to Albuquerque, and we've been driving for 3 days, getting 6 miles to the gallon, and it's just getting hot in the cab of the truck. And so I'm like, okay, I'll just roll down the window of the truck, get some nice fresh air in here. Well, it's the last day of June, and we're at Albuquerque. It's 108 degrees in Albuquerque, and so I stick my arm out, and it's like we're driving through a blow dryer. My arm's burning up. Like, what is that? The engine's on fire. So I called John Snyder and say, John, do you realize it's like 108 degrees in Albuquerque? And he says, well, it's 113 in Chandler. Welcome to Arizona. I'm like, what have I gotten myself into? And God's doing a great work there. And my boss is a guy named Gary Norton. And Gary is with us for the next 16, 18 months. And then Gary says to me, because I'm really liking Gary, I'm working well with Gary, and Gary says, hey, I'm leaving to start a church, and so I'm losing this guy that I really felt close to, and now I'm getting uncomfortable again. And he went out and started a church called Superstition Springs Community Church. You should always have the word superstition in your name if you're a church. It's just really good. So they later changed it to Mission Community Church. Mission over the last 7 years has grown from 700 to 7,000. And God's doing great work there. But he left in 1994, and then so 93 I moved there, 94 this happened, and 98 the founding pastor leaves. And in 97 he says, I think I'm going to go off and do something else. He goes up to Parker, Colorado, and gets involved in the church up there, but the last thing he did before he did that, he put his arm around me and said, this is the guy to lead you into the future. And I'm thinking, no, I'm not. You got the wrong guy, all right? Because my youth ministry was kicking it. I love youth ministry. It was crazy. We had 160 high school students in a church of 400. God was just doing amazing things. I was loving it. I had people around me for the last 5 years that had done everything I could to just build this amazing team around me. And now you're asking me to leave that and work with adults. You realize that adults are like abnormal, right? Students are normal. Adults are just fickle and weird and, stuck in their ways. And I like working with moldable people. So the board comes to me and says, hey, will you put your name in for the new lead pastor? Nope. Not going to do it. A month later, they said, well, will you be interim pastor? I said, sure. And so I do some preaching, and a month later they come back and they say, no, we really like you to put your name in. I'm like, no, not going to do it. No. I really like what I'm doing. Thank you. I'm comfortable. They come back to me the third month and they say, no, we really want you to do it. I'm about to say, and they said, all we're asking you to do is pray about it. Rats. Now you're getting spiritual on me. Pray about it. Ask God. Imagine that. Asking God what to do. And so Lisa and I were praying about it, and all our friends were praying about it, and God was changing our hearts. And so we said yes. And, we had this vote, and 96% of the people said yes to my being the new lead pastor, which is great. And in my first year as lead pastor, it was about 400 when I took over. We went from 400 people to about 200 people. Now, that's good leadership right there. Pretty hard to do. Keep your job. And a lot of people say, it's just the Gideon effect as a founding pastor, and maybe that was a little bit of it, but you know what it was? It was an arrogant young leader who thought he knew exactly what he was doing, and he was wrong. And God used that to just humble me and to force me to trust him and to force me to listen to others and to force me to become a learner again. And it got me really, really uncomfortable. Now, I don't know if you know the story, but Sun Valley made it. They're doing well. They're running the last, at Easter, there were 9,400 people at service. And 89 people gave their lives to Christ, and God's doing a great work. New lead pastor there, Chad Moore, is doing a fantastic job. And it continues to grow even more without me, which, worries me a little bit. But I'm thankful to God for what he's doing. The whole point is that I took a risk on God to get uncomfortable. And some people took a risk on me. And God used that as I tried to humble myself and realize I didn't have it all figured out. I didn't know what I was doing, and I needed someone else to help me. See, God's looking for people to leave the comfort of what is, to leave the comfort of what they have and embrace the discomfort of what should be and what could be. He's asking us to get uncomfortable for him. And this is what's happened in Nehemiah's life. In verse 4, he hears about what's happening in Jerusalem. It says this, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. And for some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." The first ingredient is eyes to see that things aren't right and a discontent with the status quo. The second ingredient is this, a heart to feel. A heart to feel. A passion to set things right. So many times I find in my life that I'm guarding my heart against the pains of the world. I'm guarding my heart against the pains of people in ministry. I'm guarding my heart. I'm protecting myself to not get fully embraced and engaged in what is happening around me. Because if I let my heart really go there, I might actually have to do something about it. I might actually have to get involved in what's happening around me. Here's what Nehemiah is looking back. He's saying, okay, the walls are still down. The gates are still burned. How could this be? They had been back for 90 years at that point in time. And 70 years ago, they had rebuilt the temple, and you're telling me that now the temple is not protected and the people are not protected, the walls are broken down, the gates have been burned in fire. What happened? Why hasn't somebody done something? The fact is that they got back there and they started to do the work, but then they're told they couldn't do the work, but then they were told they could do the work, and they just got used to the status quo. They got used to what was there. In chapter 2, he goes to them and he says, "Don't you see the disgrace we're in?" And the fact is they hadn't. All this unfinished business was just the white noise of life in a town that had fallen apart, and they refused to let themselves be pulled into it emotionally because they might actually have to do something about it. For 70 years, they didn't do a thing. There was unfinished business in Jerusalem. Let me ask you, what's the unfinished business in your life? What's the thing that God wants you not just to see, but he wants your heart to feel? What is it in your community? I talk to church planters all the time, and it's real interesting. You look for certain things in a church planter, don't you? And there's a certain character or a certain thing about them you look for. And I would talk to a church planter, and I'd say, and they would tell me, I'm going to this town and reaching this group of people. And I'm like, well, why would you do that? And sometimes they have an answer, but to a person, here's what they say. The reason I'm going there is because God's calling me. And here's the thing. I can't answer that completely, but I know there's some unfinished business. There's some things undone there. And honestly, if I don't go and do that, there's going to be something undone in me. I feel like God is doing something in me. He wants to go there. There's undone business here, and there's undone business in me. And I think God has asked me to do this, and I'm gonna follow God. What is it in your community or in your church that makes you weep? I mean, Nehemiah, it says he fasted and mourned and wept and wept and prayed. He fasted and mourned and wept and prayed. What are you weeping over in your community these days? What are you allowing your heart to engage in? And you're saying, that's not right. And somebody has to do something. What is it for you? I mean, every community has that kind of thing. A couple years ago, I took my daughter, it's about 5 years ago now, I took my daughter Ashlyn to Fiji. Because I wanted my daughter to see the ministry we had there. It's called Homes of Hope. We were rescuing girls out of the sex trafficking and bring them to a place where we're giving them the gospel and job skills and education and other things and trying to send them back, reintegrate them back into society. And so I wanted my daughter to go because she was 14 years old, and most of the moms who were there were the same age as my daughter. And so I wanted her to come see with me, and I was going to go with her. And most of these girls in Fiji, they're, the people who are selling their daughters into slavery, they're their fathers, for a lot of them. And so we were there. I remember one day we went down into the village, and we were bringing groceries to the townspeople who were down there, just saying, this is a gift from Homes of Hope. And Macrina, one of our workers, one of our leaders, came down, and she went to this little house. It's not really a house. It's more like a hut, because it only had 3 walls and a roof over. It was a thatched roof. It wasn't much of a house, but there were a young couple and the parents and a baby living in this 3-walled place. And as she walked in, there were these 2 men who were walking away, and they had kind of a disgusted look on their face. And she walks up to the woman who's there, and she's got a little baby, and she says, "Hi, my name's Macrina, and this is a gift of groceries for you." And the woman just broke down and began to cry. And Macrina's, did I do something wrong? Did I offend you in some way? And she said no, and she began to tell a story about how, and just a few minutes earlier, these 2 men came up to her. See, she had been out of work for a long time. Her parents were too old to work, and she didn't have any kind of income. And these 2 men had just come up to her and said, "We will give you a week of groceries if you give us your child." And she had said no, with no idea how she's going to provide for her family. And moments later, we walk up with a bag of groceries, and she says, I believe God loves me. I believe God provided for me. I'll never give up my child. I met another girl who told me her story. How her father used to take her to work and say to his boss, "Listen, you can have my daughter, my 10-year-old daughter, once a week, as long as I can keep my job." And for the next 5 years, that's what happened. And she was there with her two children from that business deal. I met another girl who was sold for bus fare. And you hear this, and you think, okay, somebody's got to do something. We can't let this go on. If your heart doesn't break over it, and just what's wrong? And I'm sure in your community there are things like that. Things that God has put in your heart, and things that God has positioned your church to do something about. To do justice and to love mercy as you walk humbly with God. Nehemiah is in this moment saying, wait a minute. God's city is not protected. The walls are broken down. The gates have been burned in fire. God's name, he says in chapter 2, is in disgrace. We've got to go back and build up the walls. Somebody's got to do something, and I think maybe, just maybe, it's supposed to be me. And his eyes are open to see, and his heart is open to feel, and now he's going to begin to do something about it. The third ingredient is this, that it's not just eyes that see or heart that feels, but a will that's surrendered. In order to be courageous, you have to have a will that's surrendered to God's leadership. And what we're going to see in verses 5 and following is he begins to pray a prayer. And this is different than an American prayer, because in America, prayer is like the last resort. I mean, sometimes in church, you try all these different things to remedy a problem, and then you say, well, I guess we need to pray about it. And people say, oh, has it come to that? And it's a last resort in the American church oftentimes. And the American prayer is very often about me and mine, and it's God bless me and God protect me and God watch out, my dog is having surgery and all that sort of stuff. And it's always about me and mine. We're like opera singer prayers, me, and it's all about me. And that's just not the way that Nehemiah prays. I hope at some point in time you'll study the prayers of the Bible. And you'll see how different they are from the way that we typically approach God. And so here's his prayer. It goes like this. And here's the best word I could describe is it's an alignment prayer. His job isn't to rub the side of the lamp and get the genie to come out and give him his wishes. His prayer is to align his will with God's will. God is at work and he wants us to align with him. He wants us to join him in what he's doing, not for him to join us in what we think is right. And so here's the prayer, verse 5. He says, "Then I said, Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments." Here's what he says, God, I know who you are. He begins his prayer with reminding himself of the character and the priorities of God. God, I know who you are. You're the God of heaven. You're the great and awesome God. You're a God who keeps his covenants. You have power. You have love. You have faithfulness. I know who you are, God. And he reminds himself of who God is. He reminds himself of the character of God. He begins with God. There's an old hymn that says, it's called Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. You guys know that one? Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face. And what happens? The things of earth grow strangely dim in the light of his glory, his grace. See, when we focus, what we focus on is what we're going to move toward. If we focus on the problem, if we focus on the issue, it's just going to get bigger. But if we focus on God and who he is and what he's done, he's going to get bigger. And Nehemiah knows this, and so what you focus on is what you move towards, so he chooses to move toward God. God of heaven, powerful God, merciful God, faithful God. I know who you are. And so I come to you. He says this, let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer of your servant is praying before you day and night. It's not just one time because it's not just something he sees, it's something he's let his heart engage with. And he's praying about it over and over and over and over again. We're going to find he does this for like 6 months. I mean, it's a long time. He's praying over and over and over. He says, I'm praying it day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. He says, I can't get it off my mind. I can't get it off my heart. But God, I know who you are. So I'm being persistent because I know you're consistent. I know if I come to you, I know if I ask you, I know if I recognize who you are, God, I know you'll show up. Because this is in line with your heart, God. I just know it. And then he goes on and he does something that we never do. He says this, I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We've acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, the decrees, the laws you gave your servant Moses. He starts off with, God, I know who you are. And he says, but God, I know who we are. See, you're a holy and righteous God who knows everything and does everything, and you're perfect and you're fantastic and you're gracious, but God, I know who we are. We're all like sheep that fall away, each one going his own way. We all are messed up, and he does the strangest thing here. He doesn't just confess his own sin. He confesses the sins of his family. He confesses the sins of his people. He confesses the sins of the Israelites. God, I know who you are. I know who we are too, God. We are messed up. He takes responsibility, not just for himself, but for his community. See, the Hebrews, they lived everything. They did everything in communal life. Everything, it wasn't just about me and mine. There is a personal relationship with God, but there's also a corporate relationship with God. And they all felt responsible for each other. And so they would pray on behalf of each other over and over. In the Old Testament, you see these prayers for the people of God and the people of God. It wasn't just my prayer for me and mine and my dog's surgery. And it was God, here's what we've done. And he broke down and he cried over and he confessed, listen, we've blown it. Over and over and over, we've blown it. And I'm so sorry. When was the last time that you confessed to God the deep regret for the sins of our nation? The deep regret for the sins of our community? The deep regret for the sins of our church? The deep regret for the sins of our family? And the deep regret for the sins of our lives? I mean, Nehemiah knew, I know who you are, God, I know who we are. And I'm glad you're a gracious God. We don't get what we deserve. He confesses the sins of his people. He feels personally responsible, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. And he knows they're in the predicament they're in because of this. And he's repenting on their behalf. Repentance is this. It's a change of heart that results in a change of action. A change of heart that results in a change of life. He repents on behalf of his people. They're going to change their priorities. They're going to change their actions. Verse 8 says this, remember the instruction. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeem by your great strength and your mighty hand. He goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 30, and he says, God, remember, you promised. This is what you said, God. So he says, I know who you are, I know who we are, but you promised, God. You're a God of promises. And he goes back to Deuteronomy 30. He says, listen, you said this would happen. If we turned our backs, you would scatter us. And God, you did. That's why we're over here. That's why we're in Persia. But you also said this. He says this, if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people at the farthest end of the horizons, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I've chosen as a dwelling for my name. God, you said if we repented, if we turned, if we followed you, if we trusted you, that you would show up. And so God, I'm first in line. I'm repenting on behalf of my people. And I'm just begging you, God, you promised. You promised. You said you would, God. Aren't you glad that God keeps his promises? Aren't you glad that when Jesus says, he's preparing a place for us in heaven, that we can take him at his word? Aren't you glad when he said, in the world you have trouble, but take courage, I overcome the world? Aren't you glad he said that? Aren't you glad for the promises of God? And this is what Nehemiah is doing. He said, listen, God, I know you said that, and you did exactly that, and I'm trusting you to be consistent. You said this, and so I'm convinced you're going to do this. And so, God, I'm the first one to repent, and if I'm what is necessary, if I'm what it takes to make a change, God, I'm in. Use me. See, the interesting thing about trials in the Bible is very often we look at trials and difficulties in the Bible and we say, that's just God paying us back. It's just God paying us back for what we've done. And maybe if you looked at the first part of the verse, you would think that. But most of the things in the Bible, we see these stories of people repenting and turning and God showing up in incredible ways. And you realize that a lot of the difficulty in the Bible is not God trying to pay you back. It's God trying to bring you back. It's God trying to bring you back to the things that are important to him. I mean, think about this. What if your church would go to prayer and pray, God, I know who you are, I know who we are, confess the sins and say, God, I'm leaning into the promise you gave. If we will follow you, if we will trust you, if we will align ourselves to you, God, here's what you said you would do. What do you think would happen if your church began to pray, God, I belong to you, began to align yourself with him, what do you think he would do? What do you think would happen if all our Converge Pacwest churches began to pray that? What might God do? What if all of Converge prayed that? What if the 1,260 churches and the 152 missionaries in 33 countries around the world, what if we all began to pray that? What if Christians everywhere began to realign themselves with the purposes of God, resurrender, confess on behalf of themselves, their families, their communities, their churches, their people? What might God do if we all chose to surrender ourselves to him? How might he show up? First part of the prayer, I know who you are, God. You're faithful and wonderful, and you keep your promises, and I'm so glad you're loving. Second part is I know who we are. We're sinful people, and I just confess on behalf of myself, my family, my church, my community, all the Israelites, we are messed up, and we have not followed, and I'm repenting on behalf of our people. And God, you promised. Remember that verse in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14? If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. You know what it says, right? I'll hear them from heaven and I'll heal their land. The last part of the prayer is this. He says, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name, and give your servant, talking about himself, give your servant success by granting him favor in the presence of this man. And then he explains what it means, this man. He says, listen, God, give me favor. And he says this, I'm cupbearer to the king. I'm the right-hand man of the ruler of the nation of Persia. I'm right there beside him. And listen, God, I know who you are. You're gracious and loving. You're consistent. I know who we are. We're sinful, but I'm repenting on behalf of my people. And God, you promised if we did this that you would show up in a powerful way. And I believe you positioned me perfectly beside this king to do something. So God, last part, I'm ready. I'm ready. I believe you have perfectly positioned me for this moment. And so God, I'm ready. Use me. I'm surrendered. I'm aligned. I'm ready. Could it be, because I think it is, could it be that God has perfectly positioned you in your neighborhood to be used by him? Could he have perfectly positioned you in your family to be used by him? How about if you're not in ministry? What if in your workplace? What if you work a full-time job or a part-time job outside the church? What in your workplace? Could it be that God has positioned you to be used by him in your workplace? What if God has positioned your church in the community it's in on purpose to be used by him? Are you willing to say, I'm ready. I'm ready to be used by you? Courage begins with eyes to see. And then it goes to a heart that's willing to embrace the issues of life, a heart to feel. And then it's a will that is surrendered. And the last ingredient, it's a person who's willing to take action. My will's surrendered, and now I'm just going to follow through. I'm going to go ahead and move forward in what you've asked me to do. Courage is a missing element in many of our churches and many of our lives. And I don't know what to tell you. I'm still trying to figure out the courage thing myself. I do know this. When my kids were little, I began praying a prayer with them. They were just 2 and 3 years old. And, how do you pray with kids when they're 2 and 3 years old? I mean, the kids are praying all sorts of things. God, thank you for popcorn, and thank you for puppies, and thank you for my day. And, my kids would just thank you for ice cream. And, but when they were little, we began teaching them this prayer. We prayed every day with them as we went to bed. It was this. And they probably didn't understand it when we started praying, but after a while, we saw it work. And it was this. And God, thank you for puppies and popcorn and whatever. And God, help me know the right thing to do and to have the courage to do it. And from the time my kids were little, we would pray that prayer with them. And so when times would come up and difficult things would come up, the conversation would go like this: well, what's the right thing to do? It was already in their heart, and they desired to do that. I'll tell you one last story. This whole move to Orlando is a crazy move for my family. We spent 22 years in one community. My kids were born in Gilbert, Arizona. They've never lived anywhere else. And my youngest son, David, he's the most like me, which means he's the most emotional, and he's the most stubborn. That's what I am. And I was real concerned about this whole move because the Converge asked us to move to Orlando. I mean, 22 years in one place, and now we're moving. He's a sophomore in high school, and he's a starter on the football team. He has a girlfriend. He's got so much to lose. And I remember going to him, and it was right after we got the news, and we hadn't said yes yet, and we were just talking to the family and praying about the move. And I told him about Orlando. I said, hey, bud, listen, we haven't made the decision yet, but God's kind of leading us this way, and so all I'm asking is you pray about it. And so I got home from football practice with him. He was visibly upset, tears running down his face. I mean, it's a shock to him. And so he comes out to dinner, and twice he has to leave the table because he just can't hold the emotions in. He just can't. And so I walk into his room and said, hey, buddy, listen. It's not a made decision yet. All I'm asking you to pray is, God, what do you want me to do? And I'm just asking you to have the courage to do it. He's like, okay, Dad. So I walk back out, and we're talking as a family. My older two kids and Lisa and I are talking, and they're like, Dad, whatever David wants is what we should do. I'm like, great, let's put this into the hands of a 16-year-old. And so, but David's got the most to lose, and whatever David says, we should do. And so we actually came up with a plan as a family to go back to Converge and say, listen, we would love to do this, but we're going to wait a couple years to move to Orlando. We'll move after my son graduates high school and let him finish. And it just seems like the most logical thing for him, doesn't it? Let him finish high school where he's at, and I could just do the commute thing. And, I know the commute between Orlando and Phoenix is kind of long, but I'm doing it now, it's working. And so he comes out and said, hey, David, we've got this great idea. We'll just go back to Converge. We'll tell them we're gonna wait. He looks at me and goes, and he's got this look on his face. He's like, come to the principal's office now, Dad. So I'm going to the principal's office, to my son's office, and he's sitting me down. He looks me in the eye and says, Dad, didn't you just tell me to pray? Didn't you tell me to pray and ask God what to do? I said, yes, sir. Yes, sir, Mr. Principal. I mean, yes, I did. You told me to pray, right, Dad? Yeah. You told me to ask God what we should do. Yeah. Well, God's telling me that we need to move to Orlando. I'm like, what? And he just tears in his eyes. He says, Dad, I don't want to go. I don't want to leave my church. I don't want to leave my friends. I love my life. I don't want to go. But I'm not going to disobey God. Yeah. Oh. Every once in a while, God gives you a gift. So we go back in the other room, and I bring him in and say, hey, David's got the announcement. David, you want to make the announcement? And he says, no, Dad, you tell him. I said, well, David's been praying about it, and he thinks that God is telling him that we should move to Orlando. And after we picked up the rest of the family off the floor, he began talking about, no, I think God's leading us. I think we should do this. This is the right thing. And kind of stacked hands at a family. We prayed together, stacked hands at a family. We're going to do this. And my older son pulls me into his room. Again, my older son is the one that hates change the most. He hates change. He didn't just dislike it. He hates change. He's pretty comfortable. But he pulls me in his room. My 20-year-old looks at me and says, Dad, you got to do this. I said, why? He said, well, first of all, you're bored. You took up golf. I'm like, all right. And he says, no, seriously, Dad. And he's got tears running down his face. He says, Dad, for the last 20 years, you've served us. Let us serve you. Oh, the courage. The courage. See, God is looking for a generation to join him in what he's doing, who leave the comfort of what they have to embrace the discomfort of what should be and what could be. And my question to you this evening is, will you be a people of courage? Will you get uncomfortable? Will you say, God, I know who you are. I know who we are. God, you promised if I get uncomfortable, if I take a risk, if I do this, you're going to show up. And I just want to say, God, yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready. If you know the rest of the story, it's an unbelievable story of the faithfulness of God in one of the most difficult circumstances and heroic stories in the Bible. I'm praying that for you as well. Will you pray with me? Father in heaven, thank you for your grace, your mercy, your love, your faithfulness. I'm convinced that you're ahead of us. That even when we know the right thing to do and we're so afraid of it, I believe that you're ahead of us. I also believe that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases and his mercy never comes to an end, that it's new every morning. And so we can trust you because nothing's a surprise to you. We know you're ahead of us. We know that you've gone before us. We know that if we align ourselves with you, that you already have plans for your will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so help us be a people of courage. Help us